I don't care what your ticket says. I need that seat, and you're going to give it to me. The man in 11C didn't move. He was maybe mid-40s, quiet, unremarkable in the way certain people are unremarkable on purpose, plain gray jacket, a paperback novel he'd been reading since boarding, the kind of calm, still presence you'd walk right past in a crowded terminal without a second glance. "Ma'am, I'm in my assigned seat," he said, not even looking up from his book. "I have anxiety. I need the aisle." This is a medical issue, and frankly, a real man would just be polite enough to switch without making this difficult. I was 2 rows back, watching this unfold over the top of my own book, and I remember thinking, with the specific weariness that comes from one too many delayed flights, here we go again. I had absolutely no idea that the quiet man in 11C was about to become the single most consequential person on that entire aircraft, or that the woman currently trying to bully him out of his seat was about to find that out the hard way. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I fly constantly, and if there's one thing air travel has taught me over the years, it's this: the quietest person on the plane is very often the one you should be paying the most attention to. Loud doesn't mean powerful. And the person who looks like they'd rather not be bothered is usually exactly the person you don't want to bother. Today's story is about a woman I'm calling HOA Karen, because, right on schedule, she brought up her homeowners association credentials within the first 20 minutes of this entire mess, as if running a neighborhood board somehow gave her the authority to reassign seats on a commercial aircraft. This story has a demanded seat swap, a series of strange disappearing items mid-flight, a very calm man reading a paperback novel, a confrontation that escalated way further than anyone expected, and an ending involving a reveal so satisfying I still think about the look on her face every time I fly. If you love airport chaos and karma stories, this is exactly the channel for you. Stick around, and if you enjoy it, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Let me rewind a bit, because I want you to understand exactly how normal this flight felt right up until it wasn't. I was heading home after a short work trip, nothing complicated, a 2-hour domestic flight, a middle seat I'd resigned myself to weeks earlier when I'd booked late, and absolutely zero expectations of anything interesting happening along the way. I'd gotten to the gate with time to spare, grabbed a coffee, found a seat near the window, and settled into that pleasant, low-stakes headspace you get into when a trip is simple and there's nothing left to worry about except making your connection at the other end. Boarding was smooth. The flight attendants moved through their usual pre-departure choreography, checking overhead bins, confirming seatbelts, offering the practiced, professional warmth that somehow never seems to run out no matter how many flights they've worked that day. I settled into my seat, put my book on my tray table, and genuinely looked forward to 2 uneventful hours of reading before landing. I noticed the man in 11C fairly early, mostly because he was one of those passengers who boards, sits, and simply disappears into his own quiet world without a single wasted motion, no fussing with the overhead bin, no scrolling through his phone, just a paperback novel and an easy, settled calm that honestly, I remember envying a little. If you'd asked me at that moment to guess which passenger on that flight was carrying a concealed firearm and federal authority to use it if necessary, he would have been the absolute last person I'd have picked. I remember settling into my own seat, glancing around at the usual mixed bag of a domestic flight, a college student already asleep with his hood pulled up before we'd even pushed back, a couple of few rows up quietly comparing vacation photos on a tablet, a toddler somewhere near the front babbling happily to himself. Nothing about the cabin gave off even the faintest hint that anything unusual was about to happen. If anything, it felt like one of those flights that blends into all the others in memory, forgettable in the best possible way, the kind where you land and can barely recall a single detail of the flight itself. I put my headphones in, queued up a podcast I'd been meaning to catch up on, and let myself relax into the low hum of the engines as we taxied toward the runway, completely unaware that the man 2 rows ahead of me was quietly, professionally clocking every single person who boarded that aircraft, a habit so ingrained it probably never even registered to him as unusual. She boarded about 10 minutes after most of the cabin had settled in, moving down the aisle with the brisk, entitled energy of someone perpetually running 15 minutes behind and blaming everyone else for it. Let's call her Sandra. Late 40s, oversized sunglasses pushed up into hair that looked freshly styled for a flight. She'd clearly stressed her way to the gate for, dragging a rolling bag that visibly exceeded the standard carry-on dimensions posted at the gate but had apparently made it past boarding without incident anyway. She checked her boarding pass against the row numbers, frowned, and stopped directly at row 11, her assigned seat, 11A, the window, right next to the quiet man in 11C. She settled in, immediately began adjusting everything around her with visible irritation, the seat back pocket contents, the tray table latch, the air vent, like the entire aircraft had personally failed to meet her standards before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. About 15 minutes into the flight, once we'd reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign switched off, Sandra unbuckled, leaned across the empty middle seat between herself and 11C, and made her opening move. "I need to switch seats with you," she said. "I have anxiety, and I need the aisle for airflow." The man in 11C looked up from his book, unbothered. "I'm sorry, but I'd prefer to keep my seat." Sandra's expression shifted instantly, the practiced warmth of a request sliding immediately into something sharper. It's a specific kind of transition, the one where someone's tone flips from polite ask to entitled demand in the space of a single sentence, and I've seen it happen enough times on flights to recognize the exact moment it clicks over. You can almost watch someone recalibrate in real time, deciding that charm hasn't worked fast enough and it's time to switch tactics entirely. The man in 11C, for his part, didn't react to the shift at all. If anything, his posture seemed to settle even further into stillness, the kind of calm that comes from someone who's dealt with far more volatile situations than a mildly annoyed passenger objecting to a seat assignment. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was an oddly composed reaction for such a small disagreement, though of course, I had no idea yet just how much practice he'd actually had at staying composed under pressure. "This isn't really a request," Sandra said, her voice climbing just enough to catch the attention of a few nearby rows. "I have a documented medical condition. I need the aisle seat. It's really not that complicated." "I understand that's frustrating," the man said, calm and even. "But I booked this seat specifically, and I'd like to keep it." "You'd like to keep it," Sandra repeated, scoffing. "Do you understand how selfish that sounds? Some of us actually have real needs when we fly, not just preferences." A flight attendant, noticing the rising tension, made her way over. "Is everything all right here?" "No, it is not," Sandra said immediately. "This man refuses to switch seats with me despite my documented anxiety condition. I need the aisle for airflow and I need it now." The flight attendant, professional and calm, explained gently that seat swaps were entirely up to individual passenger discretion, and that while she understood Sandra's discomfort, no one could be required to give up their assigned seat. She offered to check if any other aisle seats were available elsewhere on the aircraft instead. "I don't want any aisle seat," Sandra snapped. "I want this one. I researched this flight. I know this exact row has the best airflow from the vent above it." The man in 11C, still remarkably composed, simply said, "I'd be happy to adjust the vent for you if that would help," and reached up to redirect the airflow toward her side. Sandra stared at him like he'd just insulted her personally, crossed her arms, and sat back with a huff loud enough for at least 6 rows to hear. For a while after that, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Sandra sat rigid, arms crossed, occasionally muttering under her breath, while the man in 11C returned calmly to his book like nothing had happened at all. Then things started getting strange. A woman a few rows back reported that her headphones, left charging in her seat back pocket during a brief walk to the restroom, had gone missing entirely, not misplaced, gone, the pocket empty when she returned. A man near row 13 mentioned that his wallet, which he'd tucked into his jacket draped over the seat back in front of him, felt suspiciously lighter, and upon checking, found a $20 bill missing from an outer compartment he was certain had been there at boarding. And the flight attendant working that section noticed a first-class amenity kit, the kind typically reserved for premium passengers, sitting oddly out of place in the seat back pocket of row 12, despite no first-class passengers having any reason to be in that section of the cabin. None of it seemed connected at first glance. But several nearby passengers, myself included, had noticed Sandra making at least 3 separate trips up and down that section of the cabin, to stretch, each time lingering a beat longer than necessary near other passengers' belongings, occasionally glancing around before continuing on. The man in the aisle seat across from me leaned over and murmured, "Has anyone else noticed she keeps walking past the same 6 rows over and over?" I had. And judging by the subtle, focused way the man in 11C had lowered his book slightly, watching the cabin with quiet, practiced attention, I had a feeling he'd noticed too. What none of us realized at the time was that the man in 11C hadn't just been idly people watching. He'd been doing exactly what he was trained to do, quietly observing patterns, noting inconsistencies, keeping mental track of who moved where and when, all without ever once looking like he was paying attention to anything beyond his novel. When the flight attendant made her next pass through the cabin, gathering the growing list of reported missing items, the headphones, the $20 bill, the mysterious first-class kit, he quietly flagged her down and, in a low, measured voice, mentioned the pattern he'd observed: Sandra's repeated trips through that specific section, always timed conveniently around passengers stepping away from their seats. The flight attendant, trained to take reports like this seriously regardless of who they came from, thanked him and continued her own discreet observation, positioning herself to have a clear sightline down that section of the aisle during the meal service that followed. It didn't take long. During the service, when several passengers were distracted arranging tray tables and accepting drinks, Sandra rose once more, walked toward the back under the pretense of using the restroom, and paused at row 13 just long enough to reach into the open seat back pocket of the man whose wallet had already gone light, sliding out a small travel-sized bottle of cologne he'd stored there. The flight attendant, watching from a few rows back, saw the entire thing clearly. "Ma'am, can I see what you just picked up from that seat pocket?" the flight attendant asked, stepping into the aisle to block Sandra's path back to her row. Sandra's face flickered, that same brief flash of panic I've come to expect in stories like this, before hardening into indignation. "I didn't pick up anything. I was simply walking to the restroom." "I watched you reach into the seat pocket in row 13, the flight attendant said evenly. "Several other passengers have reported missing items during this flight as well." "This is absurd," Sandra said, voice climbing. "I don't know what you're talking about." That's when the man in row 13 leaned into the aisle himself. "That's my cologne. I noticed it missing about 10 minutes ago." Sandra, cornered, reluctantly opened her hand to reveal the small bottle she'd been trying to palm discreetly. A ripple of quiet gasps went through the surrounding rows. The flight attendant, calm but firm now, asked Sandra to return to her seat while she gathered further information, mentioning that this would need to be documented as an in-flight incident given the pattern of complaints. Sandra, red-faced, stormed back to 11A, muttering under her breath about being harassed and profiled for absolutely no reason at all. The man in 11C, still holding his book, simply watched her sit down, his expression giving away nothing. By this point, the surrounding rows had stopped pretending not to watch. A few phones were quietly out, capturing the moment the way people naturally do when they sense they're witnessing something they'll want to remember. "This is completely unacceptable treatment," Sandra announced, loud enough for a good chunk of the cabin to hear. "I am being harassed and accused of theft with absolutely no evidence." "You were literally holding the evidence," the man from row 13 said. "That could be any bottle of cologne," Sandra snapped. "It has my name written on the bottom in permanent marker," he replied. "I do that so it doesn't get lost in my bag." A soft wave of laughter rippled through the nearby rows. It was the kind of laughter that carries relief along with amusement, the sound of a cabin full of strangers who'd all been quietly rooting for the same outcome finally getting confirmation they weren't the only ones who'd noticed something was off. The man from row 13 actually allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he tucked his newly reclaimed cologne bottle back into his bag, glancing around at the small ripple of solidarity he'd apparently just inspired. Sandra, visibly rattled, turned toward the man in 11C, apparently deciding he was a safer target for her frustration than the growing list of witnesses against her. "This is your fault," she said. "If you'd simply switched seats with me like I asked, none of this would have happened." I wouldn't have had to walk around this cabin so much. The man in 11C finally set down his book fully, turned toward her, and said, in the same calm, even voice he'd used the entire flight, "Ma'am, I'd strongly recommend you sit down and stop talking right now." Something about the way he said it, not raised, not aggressive, just quietly, unmistakably certain, made the entire row around us go still. "Excuse me," Sandra said. "Who exactly do you think you are, telling me what to do?" If Sandra had simply sat down at that point, this story might have ended quietly. Instead, true to form, she pushed harder. She unbuckled again, standing fully in the aisle despite the flight attendant's earlier instruction, and announced to the surrounding rows, "I run my community's homeowners association. I know exactly how to handle people who think they can talk down to me. I want this man's information, and I want yours too," she said, jabbing a finger toward the flight attendant. "I'm filing complaints against everyone involved in this the second we land." "Ma'am, I need you to sit down immediately," the flight attendant said, her tone sharpening now, all patience finally worn through. "You're being disruptive during active flight. I'll sit down when someone actually addresses the harassment I've experienced on this flight," Sandra said, refusing to move, one hand gripping the seat back for balance as the aircraft hit a small patch of turbulence. That's when the man in 11C stood up, calmly reached into his jacket, and produced a small credential wallet, flipping it open just long enough for Sandra, the flight attendant, and the surrounding rows to see clearly. A federal badge. Air Marshal Service. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still perfectly level, "I need you to sit down and remain seated for the rest of this flight. This is now a formal instruction from a federal air marshal, and refusing to comply is a federal offense." The entire section of the cabin went dead silent. Sandra's face went through an entire sequence of emotions in about 3 seconds, confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked a lot like genuine fear as the reality of the situation caught up with her. You're an air marshal," she said, her voice suddenly much smaller than it had been for the entire flight. "I am. And I've been documenting this entire situation since it started, along with the flight attendant's own reports of theft from multiple passengers on this flight." "I didn't mean," Sandra started, but the marshal held up a hand, calm but final. "Ma'am, please sit down. Now." She sat, immediately, all the earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed silence of someone who just realized, far too late, exactly how badly she'd misjudged the situation. The rest of the flight passed in a strange, charged quiet, Sandra staring straight ahead, not saying another word, while the marshal calmly returned to his book as though nothing at all had happened, though I noticed he didn't turn a single page for the remainder of the flight, clearly keeping a close, quiet watch on her the whole time. When we landed, the seatbelt sign had barely switched off before 2 airport police officers boarded the aircraft, met at the front by the marshal, who quietly briefed them before they made their way back to row 11. Sandra was asked to gather her belongings and step off the plane first, escorted by both officers, past the entire cabin of passengers who, by now, knew exactly why. Nobody said a word as she walked past. Nobody needed to. The rest of us deplaned a few minutes later, the whole gate area buzzing quietly with the same shared disbelief. The man from row 13, once his cologne bottle was formally returned to him as part of the incident report, found me near baggage claim to compare notes, still shaking his head at the fact that the man calmly reading a paperback in 11C had turned out to be a federal air marshal the entire time. A few of us gave brief statements to airport police, confirming the pattern of missing items and Sandra's behavior throughout the flight. The flight attendant, once the aircraft had emptied, thanked several of us personally for flagging what we'd noticed, mentioning that reports like ours make an enormous difference in situations like this. I never learned the marshal's name, for obvious reasons. That's not exactly information air marshals hand out freely, but I did notice him quietly exit through a separate staff corridor once his part in the incident report was finished, disappearing back into the anonymous, unremarkable presence he'd maintained for the entire flight, like nothing dramatic had ever happened at all. I told this story to my family that night, and much like the others I've collected over the years, it instantly became one of those stories that gets requested again and again, usually starting with someone saying, "Wait, tell them about the guy who turned out to be an air marshal." What stays with me most about this whole experience is how completely Sandra misjudged the situation from the very first moment. She saw a quiet man reading a book and assumed that quiet meant powerless, someone she could pressure, guilt, and bully into giving up something that was rightfully his simply because she raised her voice and refused to stop. But the calm, controlled way he handled every single escalation, never raising his voice, never losing his composure, simply stating facts and holding his ground, was never a sign of weakness. It was exactly the opposite. It takes a very specific kind of confidence to remain that steady while someone is actively trying to provoke you, and it turns out, in this case, that confidence came from someone who was very literally trained and authorized to handle situations exactly like this one. The broader lesson here isn't really about air marshals specifically. It's about the danger of assuming you know someone's authority, capability, or patience based on how loudly they choose to assert themselves. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is exactly the person you should be most careful not to underestimate. So here's my question for you: if you'd been sitting a couple rows back, watching this whole thing unfold, at what point do you think you would have realized something was seriously off about the man in 11C? Let me know in the comments, and if you've ever unknowingly sat next to someone whose real job turned out to be way more interesting than you expected, I'd genuinely love to hear that story too. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, Sandra was not the last Karen I've encountered on a flight, and she definitely won't be the last one on this channel. Thanks for sticking around for the whole story. I know these videos run long, but the details are honestly what make moments like the badge reveal actually land the way they're supposed to. If you want more airport chaos and karma stories exactly like this one, you're in the right place. See you in the next video.